Civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or of those who have property against those who have none at all. Now, was that sentence written by the revolutionary communist Karl Marx or the so-called father of capitalism, Adam Smith? The answer might surprise you.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. 250 years ago, a book was published called The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, more popularly known as The Wealth of Nations, by the political economist Adam Smith. And there's an interesting relationship between Adam Smith as a thinker and writer and economist and Karl Marx, which we're going to talk about today with the help of a different Adam, Adam Booth, who is a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCI's organisation in Great Britain. Adam, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
So you wrote an article recently, a very interesting article, which talks about the through line from Adam Smith to Karl Marx. Might surprise people watching the show to know there's any sort of relationship between these thinkers, because they're usually presented as polar opposites. One represents communism, one represents capitalism. But before we get into how true that is or not, who exactly was Adam Smith?
Yeah, it's a good question, because obviously, as you say, today the name Adam Smith provokes ideas of like the free market and kind of libertarianism. The Adam Smith Institute, I think, is a libertarian think tank, very much a bourgeois institution. And Adam Smith himself was a bourgeois. He was a bourgeois economist, political economist, as it was known at the time. He was a Scottish Enlightenment figure, a friend of David Hume, the philosopher. And yeah, he was writing in the 18th century, taking up the ideas, the economic ideas that came before him, and trying to develop an understanding of what was called at the time the commercial society, not capitalism. That word didn't really exist in his day. But yeah, he was trying to look at the economic questions of his day and trying to come up with a kind of scientific, rational explanation for some of the economic phenomena that we saw.
Well, what was going on in commercial society, or as we call it today, capitalist society, at the time that Smith was writing, and how was that significant in terms of the way that he developed his ideas?
So, as I say, he's a Scotsman living in Britain, studying in Britain, also as a lecturer in Britain. And obviously Britain was the epicenter, really, of capitalism and the developing world market at the time. It was the biggest industrial power in the world. It was starting to develop its colonies, its empire. And you had, the rise of industry, of these big, large-scale industries in the towns, in the cities, the development of the working class. This was the beginnings and the height even of the Industrial Revolution. And obviously, huge social and economic industrial changes then going on in British society, which made Britain, and understandably, the kind of the best environment to study when it came to understanding capitalism and the laws and the dynamics of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the reason that I wanted to open with that quote earlier, which is from The Wealth of Nations, book 5, I believe, is that it might surprise people how, in some ways, cognizant of the dangers, shall we say, or evils or problems of commercial society Adam Smith seemed to be, and how seriously he took them as a problem to deal with. And also the fact that Karl Marx, when he was developing his own theories about capitalism, when he was writing Das Kapital, quotes from and extensively utilizes the arguments and ideas that Adam Smith develops. And what did, briefly, because we're going to deal with this in more depth as we move through the episode, but what did Karl Marx think of Adam Smith? What was his opinion of Adam Smith? And what did he think was the significance of Adam Smith?
Well, I think Karl Marx, when he studied his predecessors economically, And we should say Marx and Marxism, the ideas of scientific socialism, as they became known, as Marx and Engels called the whole set of ideas, they didn't just come from nowhere. They weren't just invented by Marx and Engels. They were taken, or they were kind of the synthesis, if you like, of all the best, most advanced ideas of the age that came before Marx and Engels, and that included obviously Hegelian philosophy in terms of dialectics. It included the influence of kind of utopian socialism, particularly from France, and the kind of most advanced political ideas. But when it came to economics, it was this field of political economy that was what Marx and Engels were drawing upon. And Adam Smith, along with another British economist, David Ricardo, really represented the high point of political economy, of this kind of attempt to scientifically understand capitalism and the dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. And in that sense, Marx took from Adam Smith and David Ricardo this attempt to try and analyze the economy like it was, and as it is, a system, a lawful system, a set of phenomena and processes that can be understood lawfully, scientifically, with a scientific method. And this idea of the scientific application, or trying to understand the economy in a scientific way, that was really what Adam Smith's school, the classical school as it was known of political economy, that was what really characterized them. They were the first ones to really come up with like a systematic understanding of economics, rather than just looking at individual isolated phenomena, actually trying to understand the whole system, have a framework, if you like, that kind of synthesized and linked all the different phenomena together. So I think that was the main thing that Marx took from Adam Smith, was this attempt to have a scientific approach to studying capitalism and questions of economics in general.
I guess it's no accident that the full title of Marx's masterpiece, arguably, Das Kapital, is Capital, a Critique of Political Economy. Marx was developing his ideas in, if you like, in conversation with a tradition that preceded him, and that included Adam Smith.
Yeah, I think Capital, to actually really understand that as a book, you've got to understand who it's aimed at, and a large part of it is aimed at answering these political economists, these bourgeois economists who'd come before Marx and Engels. People like Adam Smith and Ricardo. On the one hand, they had these very advanced ideas; they were pioneers in their field. But on the other hand, their ideas had their limitations, and they were the limitations of a bourgeois outlook. So a lot of Marx's work is actually a polemic against these kind of figures, taking up a lot of the same ideas and the assumptions that their own ideas, and kind of showing the logical conclusions of those ideas, and almost using their own ideas against them, saying, well, look, if you assume this, I'm going to assume this as well. But let's work through this. Let's see where this goes, and actually show how a lot of the ideas that Adam Smith and Ricardo advanced, and these other political economists, actually, when you thoroughly investigated them and took them to their logical conclusions, actually led to the conclusion that capitalism, needs to be overthrown, which I think we'll come into more later.
And that's precisely what we're going to try to do today. And we're obviously going to be quoting directly from Smith. We're going to be using Marx to help us take some of his proposals and ideas to the logical conclusion. And we'll start with one of the key concepts in Smith, which is the division of labor. He talks about this as a positive and an objective process emerging from commercial society or from capitalism. And he illustrates it famously with the example of the pin factory, where he says, and I quote, "One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it, at the top for receiving the head, with the result of the greatest improvements in the productive powers of labor." And he's counterposing this process where multiple people perform different operations on the production of a commodity, which is a term we'll come to later on, as compared to, I suppose, more artisanal individual craftsmanship, where a carpenter makes a chair or a metal worker makes a pin entirely by themselves. So can we talk about the significance of this concept of the division of labor for Adam Smith, and how he extends this metaphor to the whole of society?
Well, I think to understand this this emphasis he puts on the division of labor, because it is the first chapter in the book, The Wealth of Nations. You've got to go back to that title of the book, The Wealth of Nations, right? He's the main thing he's trying to understand and explain is what makes a nation wealthy, right? Like, where does wealth come from? And the point is that he was building upon previous schools there. You had the mercantilists, for example, who thought that wealth came from trade and exchange. And you see that today, actually, this term mercantilism often implied or used to describe people like Trump, for example, who are kind of protectionist and trying to, protect domestic industries and think that if you just hoard wealth at home, that's what's going to make you rich and wealthy. And then you had others, the physiocrats, for example, who said that wealth came mainly from agriculture, from the land, and Adam Smith was trying to say no. Actually, the significance of Adam Smith was that he said actually wealth comes from labor. Actually, it comes from the application of labor in production, and in that sense, he was trying to look at what kind of production in particular was more productive, was more wealth generating, and that's where he drew upon this idea of the division of labor, looking at how in a factory, in a workplace, you don't have people being a jack of all trades, you have people being masters, specialists of different trades, and you bring them all together under one roof, coordinate their work, and that's what made manufacturing and then large-scale industry so productive, was that you had these highly specialized workers alongside machines being brought together under one roof, under the, relying on the concentration of production in the hands of the bosses. And then he applied this to society as a whole, saying not only does a factory, an individual business, become far more productive by having this kind of specialization between different workers and then this coordination of production. We're saying the whole world economy becomes more efficient, more wealth generating, more productive if different nations specialize in certain industries, certain sectors, and then they trade with one another. Adam Smith originally developed that idea, and then David Ricardo, who followed him, came and developed it. And together it formed the kind of what we know today as the kind of classical liberal view of capitalism. That free trade, the free market, free competition is in the benefit of everyone, creates the most prosperity for society.
Can we just pick up on that point that you made about how entire nations have become specialists of the production of a particular commodity, because that feels very relevant to the world we live in right now, given that the world economy is kind of teetering on the knife edge of this very narrow strait in the Middle East. You have an entire region of the world which is devoted pretty much, or its major export is this critical commodity for powering every aspect of modern life, oil and gas. And that's one example, but you've also got parts of the world that specialize in textiles. You think about the Indian subcontinent and how important textiles is to the economy of Bangladesh, and how important the Bangladeshi textile industry to supplying the entire world with textiles. Here in Britain, we're kind of famed for our financial institutions. Similarly, in America, you've got Silicon Valley, which is the kind of center of digital, quote unquote, innovation and production and tech. So you sort of see this division of labor applied writ large in the modern world. But and you also see it, as you said, in individual firms. I mean, I'm thinking about my old workplace when I was at King's College London. We outsourced, or the university bosses outsourced, the cleaning to one private contractor and the security to a different private contractor. So it does seem that Smith was onto something here about this being a process which sort of flows objectively from the character of capitalism.
Yeah, and Marx took up these ideas. Like, he didn't deny them or discount them, but took them up and showed the logical conclusion of it all. And I mean, you read the Communist Manifesto, and it describes this process, doesn't it, of the capitalism creating this world market, creating this concentration of industry, these huge monopolies as we know them today, multinational monopolies in this day and age. And that's the point. Today we live under this enormously integrated world market, enormously socialized production where, no one country's economy can survive by itself. They're all extremely integrated, as you say. You're seeing the other side of that now when you start to have these economic shocks, these disruptions to supply chains and so forth. But the liberals aren't wrong to say that the kind of the idea of free trade and this integration of economies and these economies of scale, as they call them as well, these giant monopolies, that's the point that we as socialists constantly emphasize, that actually there is an extreme amount of planning going on within these giant firms, right? And the problem precisely today is that you have this immense level of planning within different businesses, but then it's anarchy between them, and that's the same with the question of the nation state, right? It is in the interests of everyone, if you like, to have free trade and have this division of labor globally, but at the same time there are going to be some winners and some losers. There's going to be imperialist powers that are generally plundering and exploiting the rest of the world, and there's other countries that are dominated by imperialism, and therefore when the world market starts to shrink, you start to have more competition, and all that free trade now turns into its opposite. You get the rise of protectionism and so forth, and that's the liberals kind of wring their hands and say, well, hey, it would all be better if we all just got along, but they obviously can't see there the contradiction of private property in the nation state. Like, it might well be true that everyone would benefit if they all got along, but you don't have a planned system at a global scale. You've got individual nation states with their own capitalist classes who are all interested in their own profits at the end of the day. It's not a rational system. So Adam Smith was highlighting this kind of rational side of free trade, of the free market, but obviously couldn't see how those same processes could turn into their opposite and create all these contradictions, which are ultimately the contradictions of capitalism, of private property and the nation state.
There's another side to the division of labour that, interestingly, Marx and Smith both acknowledge, which is as the production process becomes more complicated and workers become more specialised, the actual thing they do is more and more simplistic and more mind-numbing. The difference between an artisan who builds an entire commodity by themselves versus someone on the production line who just tightens one screw or drives one bolt in. And this isn't something that Smith denied. He did say this was a problem. He even talked about this increasing division of labour basically turning people into beasts and making workers increasingly inhuman because of how miserable their mode of life was. So it's interesting that he sees this problem. He doesn't really proffer a solution, as far as I can tell.
But it's quite similar, if you think about it, to Marx's idea of alienation, right? That Marx's point about alienation, like that the worker becomes alienated from their own labor, from the fruits of their own labor, because of this idea of commodity production and exchange. That is built into the idea of the division of labor, right? You have a division of labor in society. You have producers no longer producing for themselves, but producing for the other, for the market, and no longer being in control of their own lives, of their own economic activity, their own productive activity, their own human activity, and relating to each other then not as humans but as objects, as the exchange of these commodities, these things produced for the market. And the other side of it, as you say, is the result. This alienation leads to this idea that we are just like cogs in a machine. We become the appendage of the machine, was what Marx wrote. It reminds me actually of this phrase, bullshit jobs, that I don't know if it's...
David Graeber, I think, came up with that, didn't he?
Yeah, he was an anarchist, and he had some kind of not entirely correct ideas scientifically when it comes to economics, but this idea that he came up with, it resonated with a lot of people in this day and age, because yes, as you say, the scale of production, the complexity of it, the division of labor increases with the scale of production. The more productive, the more the more capitalism develops, you see, the more the division of labor becomes higher division of labor, more specialization. But in these giant multinational monopolies, if your job is just to move data from one column on a spreadsheet to another, then you've got no idea what the overall result is or how you fit into this. It's an extreme amount of alienation that people feel. And I think that's what this phrase bullshit jobs was kind of hitting upon, is this idea that people feel like they have no idea what what actual productive activity they're doing, like, or what the bigger picture is of the work. It just seems completely pointless and does just seem like bullshit. And you think, why does my job even exist? You know, what am I actually doing? Your job exists alongside thousands of other people, all coordinated by some big monopoly boss, some big CEO, and who's going to profit all of that. That's why that job exists. Capitalism doesn't just create jobs for the sake of it. It doesn't keep us employed to keep us happy. It keeps us employed because we're going to be productive, and productive for whom? Productive for the production of profit for the capitalists. And actually, that was an interesting thing Smith pointed out himself, is that he said he hit upon this idea of, it is ultimately in production that wealth is created. And he was quite scathing, actually, of all these unproductive layers that do exist under capitalism. But in his day and age, that he meant by that the church, the state, and all these kind of hangers-on and leeches of industry. Today, obviously, we would add to that the capitalists themselves. But the thing is, Smith was a defender of those capitalists. They were the rising class, if you like, trying to strike a blow against the parasitic classes of the landlords, the aristocracy, and so forth. Smith kind of represented that layer. Today, obviously, we'd say, sweep out all these parasites.
Yeah, Marx actually somewhat praises Smith for that. He says that that's the language of the still revolutionary bourgeoisie, which has not yet subjected itself to the whole of society, the state, etc. So he recognized this radical side of Smith, which still existed at this time in the history of the bourgeoisie as a class. Okay, well, we're going to move on to another important concept, which you've already alluded to a couple of times, which is the labour theory of value. But before we get there, I think we need to clarify some terminology here. So, if you can, in a sentence, can you explain what we mean by capitalism? What Smith called commercial society. What is capitalism?
Yeah, well, what both Smith and Marx recognize is that we live under this mode of production in society today, where the economy is dominated by what Marx called and Smith called the production exchange of commodities. That is to say, products that are produced for an exchange. Marx actually opens capital by saying, under capitalism, the wealth in society appears as an immense collection of commodities. And that's what the classical school, Smith, recognized as well, that there was all these things being produced not for individual consumption, but for exchange. And they wanted to understand the dynamics of that exchange, why certain commodities were exchanged for others at different ratios.
So a commodity is an object created for exchange. Capitalism is a mode of production geared towards the production and exchange of commodities. We've mentioned value. What is value? What do we mean by value?
As I said, the question that Smith and Marx and all these political economists were trying to understand is, where does this wealth come from? And why is it that certain commodities are considered more valuable than others? They exchange in greater proportions for other commodities. So, you can look at various things being produced today. Capitalism doesn't produce them because we need them. It produces them for a profit. We'll get onto this question of profit later. But nevertheless, you can see that certain commodities generally are considered more valuable than others. They are exchanged in higher proportions than others. So you might have a lot of need for cars, for example. You might have not a need for pens, but you'd really struggle to find a pen that is going to be worth more than your average car, right? You're going to, on average, if you were to exchange directly as a producer of pens for try and buy a car directly in some sort of barter economy, which we don't live under. But say you were, you'd have to produce a lot of pens in order to obtain one car.
10,000 pens for your Ford Mondeo.
Yeah, I mean, I don't drive. If I did, I'd probably have quite a beat-up old car. But even then, it would probably be worth more than even the most, fancy pen that you can obtain in your average shop or on the market. So the question there is, why is that car? Why is that more expensive commodity more valuable than this less expensive one?
Okay, but what is it that actually makes something valuable? What gives something, a commodity, its value?
Well, this is where I think we can go back to Smith, who one of his key contributions that Marx took up was this idea of the labor theory of value, which is to say that a commodity is more or less valuable depending on the amount of human labor invested in it, in its production. And this wasn't an idea that, as I say, Marx dreamt up. It came from the classical school. But even before them, there was this understanding that labor was the source of value, and you can trace that all the way back originally to even ancient times. People like Aristotle, for example, had kind of touched upon this idea of the value creating properties of labor. But it was an idea that was never fully developed in ancient times because you had slavery, and the majority of the economy was not production of commodities, but was an economy based on slave labor, not on wage labor as you see under capitalism. And that kind of blunted or distorted or kind of obscured the idea of labor producing value. But it's something that by Smith's time, with the development and the generalization of commodity production exchange, in particular, the development of wage labor, you start to really see this idea of value and the law of value asserting itself under capitalism becoming much more prominent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's no accident for those historical reasons that you have people like Benjamin Franklin saying trade in general being nothing else but the exchange of labor for labor. The value of all things is justly measured by labor.
And that was really Smith's big breakthrough, was that, as I said earlier, previous schools, previous economists had thought of particular types of labor as creating value. So your merchant created value by trading, for example, or your peasant created labor on the land, for example, with agriculture. But Smith was the one who generalized this the most and said, no, all labor is value producing, in the sense that any labor that goes into producing a commodity gives it value, and it's not just particular types of labor then, but labor in general as a source of value. And that was the big breakthrough as far as Smith was concerned, that Marx then took up and developed later. Yeah,
there's a paragraph from Adam Smith that Marx copied down verbatim in his economic notebooks, which was, it was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value to those who possess it is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which can enable them to purchase or command. So obviously Marx regarded this as a truism, although he developed upon Smith and Ricardo's labor theory of value. And actually that's something I'd like to deal with for a moment, if you don't mind. Did the labor theory of value mean precisely the same thing for Smith, Ricardo, and Marx? Is it the same idea, or is there a distinction in the way that they parse it?
I think there's the same crux of the idea that labor is a source of value, which is an idea that is rejected by modern bourgeois economists. We can maybe come back to that later. In fact, the labor theory of value had very revolutionary conclusions, actually, that Marx showed, and is precisely why today's bourgeois economists actually reject this and actually throw the baby out with the bathwater. They those who call themselves followers of Adam Smith today will say, yeah, he was good on the free market stuff, but that labor theory of value stuff, no, that's bad. We should ignore that, and it was wrong. But what they're trying to touch on there is, that Marx developed this idea. And took it forward and showed some of the kind of contradictions within it. But in particular, the difference between Smith, say, and Marx was that Smith, he was a bourgeois economist at the end of the day, and was kind of restricted by a bourgeois kind of individualistic outlook and quite an abstract outlook in how he looked at economic questions. So for him, the labor theory of value, this idea that value came from human labor, he actually thought it didn't really apply in modern day capitalism, and that it was more some sort of economic law that applied, in pre-capitalist times when we were hunters and fishermen. And basically his model of the economy was one of like direct barter, if you like, where we all produced our own goods and then might exchange some surplus that we created with other people. Like, if we were a hunter and we managed to kill more animals than we needed for ourselves, we'd go and find a fisherman who'd fished more fish than he
Yeah.
needed for themselves, and you'd trade them, and you would say, well, okay, if I spent my day collecting together, ever many I don't know, what do you hunt, deer, for example, and I have a surplus of deer, and then I'm gonna go and exchange that for the surplus of fish that I want some fish for my dinner instead of deer every day. I'm going to go to my fisherman friend, and he's going to have spent so long producing so many fish, and we would work out, well, I got 20 deer in the time it took for you to get 10 fish.
Yeah.
So therefore, your fish is worth twice as much as my deer.
I like the example that he uses. He says that if in a nation of hunters, it usually costs twice the amount of labor to kill a beaver than it does to kill a deer. I don't know how you measure how much more difficult it is to kill a deer than a beaver, but as you say, he's decided that it's about double. So-
Exactly. And the point is, deer, beavers, fish, whatever it is, it's very abstract, and it doesn't actually explain capitalism as we see today, right? We don't live in some sort of primitive hunter-gatherer society, or we're not. The other model that Smith and Ricardo often talked about was the idea of a Robinson Crusoe. They imagined that the economy was just lots of isolated, atomized individuals producing away, and then occasionally coming into contact with others who they traded with. And so they imagined, that there was Robinson Crusoe on his island, producing maybe a boat in half of the day, and then collecting some coconuts for the other half of the day. And he would say, well, if I spent half my day collecting 100 coconuts, and it takes me half a day to make a raft, then that raft is worth 100 times the amount of one coconut. And that was their kind of idea of the labor theory of value. Very, very individualistic, very atomized, very abstract. And they basically imagined capitalism to be a kind of scaled up version of lots of individuals trading with one another. Whereas in reality, Marx is pointing out, capitalism is this massive system of this generalized commodity production exchange, and it's mass production, it's socialized production. A commodity isn't something that you individually produce and then exchange with others. It's something that is produced by big businesses, by these giant monopolies at a massive scale, involving, today, global supply chains. And therefore, it's not about the individual labor time that you put into the commodity that gives it value. It's about what Marx called the socially necessary labor time. That was one of the big developments of Marx's labor theory of value, that he saw the law of value as a social question, as a social relation, not between individuals in some barter, but in this economy, governed by money, governed by capital, governed by mass production, socialized production. And in that sense, we establish whether labor time is necessary by going to exchange. You discover the value of something not by chatting to the guy that you're trading with, but by trying to sell it as a business on the market. If you find that the product you've made is you've had to spend a lot longer producing it and have higher costs of production than the average price on the market, this objective quantity that confronts you, then you're going to go out of business. And that's the point, is through then competition, through supply and demand, through competition, through these market forces, that you arrive at an understanding of what the value of a commodity is. It's not something you can discuss on a desert island.
Sure, and we'll come back to this question later on, but it's my understanding that Smith rejected the idea that the labor theory of value really applied at all to industrial society, right? He said that it was limited to what he called the early and rude market, i.e. the barter economy. And he said that in industrial societies, the exchange value of a commodity is basically the sum total of wages, profits, and rents required to pay for the three main factors of production: labor, capital, and land. So you bring this sum together, and that's the exchange value.
Yeah, and that relates to the point I was just mentioning, that for Marx, he saw this idea of the law of value, or value, the labor theory of value, ultimately, as this objective social relation, right? It's, you go into a shop, you can't haggle over the price generally under capitalism. You go into a shop, you go onto Amazon or wherever you buy your goods, onto some supermarket website, and you're confronted by this objective price, right? It's something objective that confronts you. And that's, that's the laws of the market, the law of value, telling you what this good is worth. Now, for Adam Smith, he sees it more subjectively, if you like, in the sense of imagining that the capitalists can just arbitrarily kind of determine their prices by adding up their own costs, as if they weren't in competition with one another, as if there weren't some kind of objective social force that compels them to sell at lower than their competitors, for example. And I think this has important implications, because if you think that prices are just these arbitrary things that can kind of be subjectively decided, that leads to certain political conclusions. And actually the bourgeois themselves kind of utilize this thinking to try and attack the working class. Like, we're about to probably undergo another inflationary crisis, similar to the one that followed the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And I remember at that time, they wheeled out an argument that has basically always been wheeled out whenever there's inflation, which say, workers are to blame for inflation, because if you demand higher wages, then that's going to push up the price of goods, and that's what's going to cause inflation. And then that's going to cause a kind of vicious spiral of inflation. They call it a wage price spiral. And this is the argument of the bourgeois economists. And it's a reactionary argument. It's a false argument.
Yes.
And it's based on Adam Smith's idea that basically you can just determine the value of something by adding up the wages, the profits, and the rents. And funnily enough, the left wing also turned this argument inside out with the argument of greedflation, which you also saw in that last inflationary wave, saying that, the bosses can just arbitrarily profiteer and jack up their profits, and that's what's pushing up inflation, as if the bosses weren't also in competition with each other in general, and that forcing them to actually push the price towards some sort of objective value. So you see how both the bourgeois and the reformists actually utilize this idea of Smith to draw their own political conclusions, which in the case of the bourgeois are very reactionary, are used to attack workers' wages. In the case of the reformists, are very utopian, are used to argue that it's all just kind of arbitrary, and you could just get rid of inflation by just choosing to not be greedy.
Yeah, the workers, from the point of view of the bourgeois, the workers could simply choose to get less wages, and from the point of view of the reformists, the bosses could simply choose to get less profits.
And I think, what Marx was trying to highlight is that, again, there is this kind of this role of competition of the market at establishing prices, but it's always going to fluctuate around something that is objective, that is predetermined, if you like. You can't just add up the wages and the profits and the rents. Actually, what Marx is pointing out, that wages, profits, and rents, they're not like these independent components that come together to form the value of something. He said it's the other way around. Actually, you create the value in production through labor, through the application of socially necessary labor in production, socially necessary determined by whether or not it's as productive and as efficient as it could be compared to your competitors. And then once that value's been created in production, then it's divided up between the different classes in society in the form of their different sources of income, whether it is the wages, the income for the workers, the profits, the income of the capitalists. The analogy I like to think of is like you don't create a cake or a pie by having different slices of cake and then adding them together to get your total pie, right? You bake the pie, you make that's a labor intensive process. And then you divide it up amongst the different people who expect a slice. And the problem we live under today is that the slice is getting bigger and bigger that goes to the capitalists and to the landlords, and a smaller slice gets to go to the workers. And that's why the capitalists always protest when these kind of questions of inflation come up, because what they don't want is the workers getting a bigger slice at their expense. And that's ultimately what the class struggle is about, right? Either the workers get better wages at the expense of the capitalists, or the capitalists are getting better profits at the expense of the workers.
Yeah, it's interesting. While you were talking about the inflationary crisis after the pandemic, it reminded me of the big strike wave that emerged in Britain and America and elsewhere as workers who'd been through the pandemic and lockdowns and all of the precarity and uncertainty and misery that caused. And they responded to the fact that their money was suddenly buying them less as a result of a process that they had no control over, that wasn't their fault. They responded by going on strike in order to defend their conditions. And it was in that context that you had all the papers, all the politicians basically lambasting the working class for having the temerity to fight to protect its standards of living at a time when we need to bring inflation down. And that means you need to be paid less. We need people to be poor, was the argument they were making. There were recordings coming out of discussions between the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the head of the Bank of England just openly saying, to get this under control, we just need people to suffer. We need people to be poor.
And I think that, like I say, all these theories, they have political conclusions. And the conclusion of Marxist theory, why Marxist analysis is so important, is that, value is produced by the working class. The working class does not receive back the full value it creates in the form of its wages. And if you want to prevent things like inflation and all this kind of chaos of capitalism, you need to demand the whole bakery. If we're going to talk about the cakes and the pies, let's not, squabble over crumbs. Like, let's demand the whole bakery. And that means, we're in favor of expropriation. Let's seize the means of production, the means by which all of this wealth is created in the first place, rather than, as the reformists say, just redistributing the slices that have already been baked,
And I guess the revolutionary conclusion of the idea that the law of value is based on capitalist commodity production. So it's not some reflection of an eternal human truth or something about human nature, which is kind of implicit in the Robinson Crusoe analogy, where you just plonk anybody on an island and they'll create like a miniature version of capitalism, reflecting their essential human nature. If the law of value is in fact historically contingent on capitalism, on capitalist society, which hasn't always existed, then you can understand it and you can overcome it and you can overthrow it.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of these things we've probably all heard of, or heard, thrown at us when we try and argue for socialism, for communism, is the idea, but what about human nature? And the bourgeois economists really lean into that idea, right? That the market, the invisible hand of the market, as Adam Smith referred to it, that idea that that is some natural state of humanity, to be in competition with each other, this kind of survival of the fittest. It's almost like this Darwinian idea applied to human society, and that's our natural state of being. And it's presented in a very mystical way, as I said, like the invisible hand. It's this idea that the economy is something that's done to us rather than something that we have created, that we are in control of. And that's true, because under capitalism, because of that alienation, because of the question of private property, the capitalists, they are the ones in control, right? They're in control of the means of production. And it does seem like, all of the laws of capitalism then are this kind of mystical force imposed upon us, and it's like the law of gravity, or the force of gravity. It's something we can feel the effects of, but you can't touch it, you can't see it. And that's what I think a lot of the kind of the dynamics of capitalism feel like to ordinary people, right? It's something we're compelled to work for the boss, and the bosses are also compelled to compete with one another. There's these objective forces imposed upon us. But rather than seeing them in a mystical way, as the bourgeois do, that only the kind of high priests of finance and of banking, of capitalism, the strategists of capital, only they can understand. We understand, no, there is this lawfulness to the economy. We can understand those laws. We can make sense of them. And in doing so, we can actually then, as you say, transform them, overcome them, and actually take control of our own lives, take control of our own destinies. So I think, there's a very powerful, powerful conclusion that comes with a scientific Marxist understanding of the economy.
Something else I wanted to deal with. We've talked about value and we've kind of mentioned price, the market price of something. And this is a distinction that I think a lot of people find a little bit hard to square. What do we actually mean by price as opposed to value, which, as you've already explained, is a product of labor?
Well, I think that's it. Was that something like value? It's not a property of something like intrinsic to it, right? You can't smell or touch the value of something, and yet, as I say, it is something objective, right? It is something that you're confronted with when you go to the shops, when you try and buy something. And yet there's also all this kind of randomness, this noise, if you like, around that. It's not like prices are static every day. Prices of all sorts of commodities are changing. You talked about the effects of the Iran war, right? And the price of oil going up and down due to, well, obviously there's a large amount of speculation involved in that.
Trump's Truth Social post seemed to have something to do with the price as well.
There's definitely all sorts of weird, corrupt reasons going on behind that. But there is something objective there as well, isn't there? That a large amount of the supply of oil is going to go off grid. The demand is largely going to stay the same, and therefore the price goes up. Marx didn't deny the role of supply and demand and these market forces in that respect, but he said that they are not completely arbitrary at the same time. There's a certain accidental nature to them, if you like, but there's a necessity that underlies the movements of prices. In other words, going back to the original example, we talked about cars and pens, the price of those things will change from day to day with supply and demand. But largely, the average, if you like, of the price of the car will always be higher than the price of the pen, for example. And that is then where this kind of average around which prices are fluctuating comes in. And what Marx was trying to say is, like, get rid of the noise, if you like. Marx's method was to look below the appearance of things to the essence of them, if you like. That's where his dialectical method comes in. We don't look at the accident, we look at the necessity. We don't look at the random bit, but the lawful bit, if you like. And the lawful part of this setup, of this system, is that idea of value, of this labor theory of value, the socially necessary labor time that goes into something, being that kind of average around which the price fluctuates.
What do you say to people who go, aha, but what about, for example, designer jewelry or rare works of art? They don't necessarily contain as much intrinsic value as is reflected by the price they fetch. I think that the Sunflowers by Van Gogh is a beautiful work of art, but I don't think he spent, millions upon millions of hours painting the damn thing. But it fetches an astronomical price on the market. So isn't that a flaw in Marx and indeed Adam Smith's perhaps conception of labor theory of value, that you can have these commodities where the price is so drastically divorced from the intrinsic value crystallized within them?
Well, I think that brings out the difference between Marx's idea of the labor theory of value and his predecessor's version of it, which is, as I said, for them, it was all about individual production and how much labor had gone into the individual commodity. Whereas Marx is talking about value as the product of a social system, right? It's a social relation. And in that sense, we're not really concerned about individual commodities, which, may or not have had this or that amount of labor time gone into them. We're talking about commodities being something that are produced on a mass scale, right? And it's the average amount of labor time that needs to go into that, given the current amount of technology, of technique in society, right? The value of things changes over time as you increase the productivity of labor or the technology, the efficiency in this or that industry, its value can come down. And prices, as I say, can fluctuate with supply and demand. But what we're talking about here, when you talk about rare works of art or even things like housing, for example, are things that are not mass produced. They're not replicable, infinitely replicable. A work of art, as you said, is a work of art. There's a limited supply of it. If you want a genuine Van Gogh or a genuine Picasso painting, there's a very limited supply. You can't mass produce them. You can't establish some sort of socially necessary labor time to it. And therefore, the price is purely determined in that situation by supply and demand. And there's the supply is limited. The demand may be very high. Therefore, the price can go up. And the price becomes completely divorced from the actual labor time that's gone into it. And in fact, those kind of objects tend to then become vehicles for speculation, where the price has no relation really to the actual labor time that's gone into it. That's what's happening with housing today as well, right? There's a very limited supply of housing because of the profit system, because of all the profiteering landlords and construction companies and so forth. And as a result, the actual socially necessary labor time in the housing, the amount of construction labor that's gone into it and so forth, that is an objective quantity, but then the price can wildly diverge from that because there's this limited supply and a massive demand. So yeah, I think what those kind of examples show is not actually the incorrectness of Marx's idea, but the correctness. That if you stand back and don't just look at the individual commodity, but look at the system as a whole, you can understand why certain commodities are worth more than others. You can understand the motion, the dynamics of those commodities, and you can understand from that also the motion and dynamics of money, of capital, and of capitalism as a system. So yeah, I think it's about understanding what Marx is really trying to get at with his economics. Like if you study bourgeois economics, which I've had to do a little bit, they're obsessed with this idea of microeconomics, they call it, which is these supply and demand curves, and they try and establish the price of these individual commodities. It's kind of like Oscar Wilde's quote: "They know the price of everything and the value of nothing." These bourgeois economists. But Marx wasn't interested in explaining why this commodity is worth that particular price or why that commodity. Sometimes comrades ask me, "Oh yeah, but can you apply Marxist economics to understand why this particular commodity is this price at this?" No, you can't actually. Marxism isn't about trying to explain the speculation that we see today, or the erratic movements of prices of this or that commodity. It's about trying to understand the system as a whole, why it has all these contradictions, why it inevitably goes into crisis, and I think understanding that purpose, that aim of Marx's studies and his writings is very important, and that's the main rebuttal to these kind of accusations that you hear leveled against Marx.
I suppose we should be as fair as possible to the better classical economists, because even Ricardo said, and I quote, "These commodities," and he's talking about precisely sort of these luxury goods, and I think he is talking about rare works of art here, actually, however, form a very small part of the mass of commodities daily exchanged in the market. So the point that he makes is, okay, sure, like these individual examples, fine, but we're talking about the general processes here, and that's much more important if you're trying to understand capitalism scientifically.
Exactly, and often what you find is these examples that are pointed to by bourgeois critics of Marx, they're actually often proving the opposite point of what they're intended to do, because take your Van Gogh painting, for example. Van Gogh painting purely determined in terms of its price by supply and demand because of its limited supply, right? And it's not a genuine commodity in that sense. However, if you tried to create a commodity out of Van Gogh paintings, if you were a printer, for example, selling replicas, printed replicas, how much are you going to be able to charge for that? You're going to be able to charge not much more than your actual costs of production plus an average rate of profit. You're going to charge for the cost of the printing and a little bit for yourself. That's all you can charge, because you're in competition with lots of other people who've got access to printers who can produce the same thing, a framed print for people's homes as a commodity. And therefore, you actually see the real value of that commodity establishing itself through the competition, which doesn't really exist when you've got that single item. Marx also made the same point actually in Capital. He had a very prophetic passage where he's talking about diamonds, because this is an example often brought up. Oh, what about diamonds? Aren't they valuable because people just love a diamond? They want a diamond wedding ring.
They like shiny rocks.
Yeah, and actually that was a whole marketing campaign, by De Beers, was you need a diamond to show to your loved one, to prove your love, when you're engagement and so forth. And Marx actually made the point that, okay, diamonds, again, they're actually quite a limited supply of them, and therefore supply and demand plays a large role in determining their price. But he predicted actually, if diamonds could be mass produced in an industrial scale, then actually their price would massively come down. And that's exactly what started to happen in modern times, that now actually they can produce replica synthetic diamonds in factories, in these kind of industrial settings, and they can mass produce them such that the price of diamonds in general is going down, because you can't tell the difference between those and the natural ones that they're mining. And they're using these kind of these industrial diamonds in industry itself, in cutting tools and so forth. And it's actually causing the profits of those big mining monopolies like De Beers to actually go down. So a very good example there of where once the law of value can apply, once you do have that competition and that mass production, then you see the law of value asserting itself and prices tending to, actually starting to go towards the actual real value, the socially necessary labour time.
I think that's that particular gotcha well and truly refuted. So I want to come back to this phrase which you alluded to earlier, the invisible hand of the market, which does come from Smith.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from this particular passage, where he's referring to the greed and self-interest of the capitalist actually ultimately being a good thing for society, because it's in the striving for individual enrichment that the capitalist creates more wealth for everyone. And he ends by saying that the capitalist is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So basically, the only thing the capitalist cares about is his personal enrichment, but the general process of commercial society is for the betterment of everyone, and that's completely separate from the capitalist intentions. They're not trying to make everybody wealthier; they just do as a result of doing business. So, how true is this? Is it true that as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats?
Well, I think there's a truth in so much as, in the heyday of capitalism, this idea of competition and production for profit, which is ultimately what Smith is talking about, is this idea that the capitalists are compelled by competition to invest in new machinery to make their own production processes more efficient, more productive. That does develop the productive forces, as we would say. Marx paid tribute to that. In the Communist Manifesto, he says, capitalism has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids and Roman aqueducts. He said it played a revolutionary role in concentrating production, in creating large-scale industry and developing technology and science and so forth. All of that was thanks to the profit motive and the self-interest, if you like, of the capitalists in this commercial society that Smith was talking about. So there is genuinely, or was, we should say, in the heyday of capitalism, a force of competition, of profit, that was developing the productive forces, that was revolutionizing society. However, where you see the limits of Smith is he only sees one side of the process. He sees that force in a very one-sided way, that only as a progressive force that creates this rising tide, as he says, this prosperity, this enrichment for the whole of society, that creates this wealth of nations, as he put it. He doesn't see the other side of it, which is that very same motor force of profit and competition also contains enormous contradictions and can actually then turn into its opposite. It becomes a force actually holding society back, a society responsible for huge crises. That, again, is what Marx pointed out in the Communist Manifesto. It becomes capitalism, he says, like the sorcerer who's conjured up powers from beyond the netherworld that he can't control. In other words, it's the same competition, the production for profit, ultimately, the same law of value, if you like, that actually contains these inherent contradictions that lead not to efficiency and prosperity, but to huge amounts of waste, huge amounts of destruction, huge contradictions that we can see plainly today. I mean, where's the efficiency in having millions of empty homes alongside millions of homeless people? Where's the efficiency of having millions of people unemployed who could be put to work productively but aren't, because it's not profitable for the capitalists? And instead, you have a whole other section of the population that is overworked, that has long working hours, maybe 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. Like that shows you that far from being this super efficient system, the invisible hand actually is something that creates enormous amount of destruction, that really wreaks havoc upon society. And I think that's where, again, you see the revolutionary conclusions of Marx that point out that chaos, that destruction, these crises we see, they're not accidental. Like that was the problem with people like Smith and Ricardo. They could start to see some of these crises developing in their time, particularly by Ricardo's time in the middle of the 19th century. But they just saw them as accidents. They just saw it as like, a bad policy choice, for example. And you see that today with today's bourgeois economists, right? if there's a world crisis now, for example, they say, oh, it was because of the Iran war, you know, because Trump was a silly and a maniac who went in without a plan, you know, and pushed up inflation and caused a recession. And so they said the same thing about like the Ukraine war or the pandemic, or 2008 crisis was, you know, not because of any intrinsic problem within capitalism. It's just greedy bankers. We just needed more regulation and so forth. So for the bourgeois, all of these crises of their system are not because of the system. They're accidents. They're because of, you know, irrational choices, individual bad policy choices and so forth. For us as Marxists, and what Marx showed was that no, actually, it's the very ideas that Smith and Ricardo advanced that, if you take them to logical conclusion, lead precisely to these contradictions, to these crises. The idea, particularly of overproduction, that Marx talked about.
Yeah, and we'll come on to the question of overproduction, which is obviously critical to Marx's analysis of capitalism. But I wanted to also touch on profit, because there's something that you might find a bit difficult to wrap your head around at this point. If you're following Smith's logic, I'm making a trade, I'm self-interested, you're self-interested, but we both have a surplus to exchange, and we work it out and we go home happy. But at a certain point, someone's getting richer than somebody else. At some point, someone's making a profit, which means what exactly? Has someone been cheated? Has someone snuck a bit more value or price out of their commodities than they're actually worth? Has it been swindled? Is it something else going on? Is there some third element intervening? Where does that profit come from in terms of Smith's conception of capitalism? And we'll come on to how Marx deals with the issue as well.
Well, yeah, that was the big enigma that the classical economists like Smith and Ricardo were trying to solve. It was a real riddle that you know, that they could never quite get their heads around fully. And in fact, that was then the big development of Marx, was to solve this enigma, if you like, and show the way out of that riddle. And I think the thing was, they were looking at society at the time. They could see, yeah, there's this wealth being created. Society's getting richer. The capitalists are, in particular, getting richer. Where is that richness coming from? And their predecessors, the mercantilists, had basically this idea that it was all swindling, right? That basically you cheated your trading partner, right? You managed to somehow buy cheap and sell dear, and you made a little profit. That's how merchants do make their profit, right? They buy in one place for one price, they sell in another place for another, and they pocket the difference.
Buy $1, sell for $2.
But it doesn't make society as a whole richer, right? It's the idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Peter and Paul collectively are no wealthier, but one might be poorer at the other's expense, or rather, one might be richer at the other's expense. And the question then is okay, wealth isn't created, profit isn't going to be generated through distribution, if you like, through exchange, through circulation, as Marx described it. It has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from production. It has to come from, ultimately, from this value created by labor itself. But this, again, is where there was a bit of a mystery for Smith and Ricardo, because they could see the capitalists and the workers exchanging with one another. And as liberals, they said, well, like, this is a fair exchange, right? The whole model of liberalism was built on the idea that you had these producers, these exchanges of commodities coming together, and it was a fair exchange. There was no plundering, there was no robbery going on. In capitalism was a just system, you know, on average. And yet, if the capitalists and the workers are exchanging on a fair basis, you know, the worker is paid a wage and they give in return their labor to the capitalist, well, where's the problem there? Well, it seems to actually be both fair but also unfair, because the capitalist somehow ends up with more than they started with. And that they couldn't really get their head around, because they were like, well, we're paying a wage, we're getting the labor, what's the problem? But yet somehow the capitalist ends up with more value than they put in to start with, right? That they sell a bunch of commodities that contain a certain amount of value, a certain amount of labor time, and yet they pay back to the worker less than that in the form of wages. And Smith kind of touched upon this idea. Ricardo as well kind of could see, well, that somewhere in that process there is this profit coming, you know, it's being generated, but they couldn't quite put their finger on how that could come about without breaking the law of value, the idea that you exchange according to the labor time that's gone into your commodity.
So how does Marx resolve this problem then?
Well, Marx, his big revolutionary step, if you like, probably his biggest in many respects, was to differentiate between the idea of labor and labor power, because that was the term that I think was really confusing all the bourgeois economists, the classical economists. They thought that what the capitalist was buying from the worker, the commodity that the worker sold, was the actual labor, i.e. the actual work was being bought off the capitalist. But when you think about it, that's not what the capitalist buys off their workforce. They don't buy actual output from the workers, right? They don't buy the actual commodities that the worker produces. They buy the ability of the workforce to work, to produce, and that's then the difference between labor and labor power, right? It's not the labor that the capitalists buy up, but the labor power, the ability of the worker to work for a given amount of time. So they will buy a work day, a work week, a work month. The boss will buy these things. And then it's up to them as the boss, as the capitalist, to try and get as much actual labor out of the worker in that time as they can, as much actual work, try and squeeze them harder, make them more efficient, more productive with machinery, with training, with technology and so forth. And in fact, that's the whole revolutionary basis of capitalism, that it encouraged, incentivized the capitalists to make their workers more productive by giving them more machinery, more skill, more technology and so forth. But yeah, it was fundamentally that understanding that what wages are is the price of labor power, right? And the key to understanding the origins of profit, where profit comes from, is understanding the difference between, if you like, the exchange value of labor power, which is the wages, right? That's the price of the ability to work that the capitalist pays. But then the use value of that labor power is higher, right? They can get more labor out of the worker than it costs to actually maintain the worker themselves. The labor power is like any other commodity, in the sense that it requires a certain amount of labor to produce all the commodities that workers need to sustain themselves, all their means of subsistence. You have housing, you have clothing, you have education, healthcare needed to maintain the working class as a whole. But all of that can be produced in, say, half the working day across the whole of the working class. And then in the rest of the working day, it's effectively free labor that's being conducted by the workers. And all of that is then the source of the surplus labor, becomes the source of surplus value that the capitalists appropriate and divided up amongst the different elements of the capitalists. The bankers get their interest, the landlords get their rent, and the bosses get their profit.
I'm just going to quote quickly from Marx here, because he sums it up beautifully. Labour power is, in our present-day capitalist society, a commodity like every other commodity, but a very peculiar one. It has the peculiarity of being a value-creating force, the source of value, and moreover, when properly treated, the source of more value than it possesses itself.
That's it.
So, if it's the case that surplus value is where the capitalists get their profits from, is that also the same place that ultimately the workers get their wages from? Because is that what the capitalists then use to pay for more labour power?
Well, that's it. All the value in society is ultimately being created by the working class. But, the actual wages of the worker, that what they go and use to buy, the food they need, the housing they need, and so forth, all of those commodities that go into the wages of work, they can probably, be producing a fraction of the overall time that the workers are producing. But it's not like the working class then stops producing once they've created their own kind of means of subsistence, if you like. They carry on working, and the capitalists carry on putting them to work, making more commodities containing more value. But then you arrive at this contradiction that Marx identified, right? Which is the idea that, okay, the workers have produced a certain amount of commodities that go into their wages. They keep producing more commodities, but then who's buying those commodities? Because it's the very same wages of the workers that form the demand for majority of these commodities. You know, and what Marx hit upon was this idea of overproduction that I mentioned earlier, that the working class inherently produces more value in the course of the working day, the working week, than they can absorb in the form of their wages. Right? They receive back a fraction of the value they create in the form of wages, and therefore, if you like, capitalism is always going to produce more than the market can absorb. There's always going to be this glut of goods being churned out, particularly because capitalism is an anarchic system and all the individual capitalists are doing this without any idea of the total demand, the total market that's out there. And they're all in competition, trying to produce more in order to get a bigger slice of the market, a bigger slice of the profits. And so the general tendency then is towards this idea of overproduction, capitalism producing more than can be absorbed by the market. And that, Marx said, is fundamentally one of the main causes of the crisis of capitalism.
But why is that a problem? Why does it matter if there's more being produced than the market can absorb?
Because at the end of the day, capitalism is a system of production for profit. You talked about right at the beginning, what is capitalism? We talked about commodity production exchange. But yeah, commodity production exchange for profit, right? Commodities are things produced for the market. You're producing things as exchange values, not as use values, as Marx differentiated. And in other words, it's a system based on production for profit rather than for need, right? It's not a rational system where we produce according to society's needs in some sort of conscious democratic plan of production. It's a system based, as I say, on this blind market, on this private, property and production for profit. And the result is then, that if the capitalists can't sell their goods, well, they're not going to be able to realize the profit that's contained, in these goods. You've got this surplus value that's being created by the working class in production, but it has to be realized in exchange. You have to sell the goods in order to obtain that profit. And if the capitalists can't do that because there's no demand for these things, people can't afford to buy these goods, then you're just going to have goods piling up, all this glut appearing in society. And again, it's a contradiction because you'll have this poverty going on amidst plenty, right? That's the major contradiction of capitalism, that you see, as Marx said, these crises of overproduction, almost like there's been a war or a famine, Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, not because there's too little being produced, but because there's too much, he says, too much industry, too much commerce, too much means of subsistence. And that just shows the complete irrationality and madness of capitalism, and it's inherent within the idea of private property, production of profit, and this idea of the law of value. And you've got to overturn it and have a rational planned economy production for need rather than profit to get rid of this contradiction.
So, moving into the modern day then, the modern inheritors of the ideas of Adam Smith, at least in name. You mentioned the Adam Smith Institute earlier, and they've got mission statements on their website where they talk about Smith recognizing that freedom and self-interest don't need to produce chaos, but as if guided by an invisible hand, the greed and self-interest of the capitalists create order and concord. And I quote, "A prospering social order would grow organically as a product of human nature, grow best in an open competitive marketplace with free exchange and without coercion." So basically, they say that Smith's ultimate conclusion is that if you just take all of the stabilizers off the market, let it rip, let it do its thing, then following its natural processes, it will result in the best possible society. I can't help but think, though, about the people who've actually tried to put this into practice to at least some extent. And that lead me to think about Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, who is a self-described anarcho-capitalist, he thinks.
Libertarian
and
nutcase,
libertarian.
I think, is the better description.
Yeah, maybe I was being too kind. A libertarian nutcase, Mr. Chainsaw Man, who came to power promising to bring inflation down, essentially by gutting particularly the public sector. He also famously said that he was in favor of legalizing selling organs on the open market because, I quote, "My first property is my body. Why shouldn't I be able to dispose of it?" So why not be able to sell my kidney and lungs on the open market? They're my kidney and lungs.
I
That's
think
my
you
choice.
should go first and
No one
set
wants-
an example.
No one wants my kidney or lungs, Adam. But he came to power in December 2023 for reasons we don't have time to go into, but I'll link some articles in the description, where he carried out his chainsaw austerity plan, and it did bring inflation down from 200% to about 30%, but at the cost of 200,000 jobs, 18,000 businesses closing, household debt skyrocketing, and buying power collapsing. Since he assumed office 2 or 3 years ago, the poverty rate in Argentina has gone to more than 50%. It fell back to 30%, but it lingers in that margin. And I found an interview with an Argentinian woman who was protesting at Milei's program, who said, "We don't have enough to eat, to live, to think about holidays or free time. People with disabilities already struggle to find jobs because no one will hire them. And now many older people have lost their pensions because Milei took them away." So essentially, he's solved, quote unquote, one problem by just decimating the wealth of society. It's a long way from the invisible hand resulting in the wealth of nations being increased. And then the economy went into crisis as a consequence of this, and Milei had to be rescued by the very visible hand of Donald Trump, who handed him a $40 billion credit swap in order to pull him out of the morass because he's a political ally. So you could say this is an earnest college try at putting these conclusions derived from some interpretations of Adam Smith into practice. But this doesn't sound like what Adam Smith, even in his own words, was arguing for, let alone the limitations and contradictions that Marx identified. But this seems to be the state of the people who inherit his ideas today.
Well, I think this is a point that even Marx highlighted in his day, was that people who came after Smith and Ricardo, they weren't interested in scientifically actually explaining and understanding capitalism. He said they'd become apologists for capitalism. They'd become basically just mercenaries, the modern bourgeois economists. They're just mercenaries for the capitalists, and they're brought out to just try and justify all of the most rotten elements of capitalism rather than actually explain why the world is the way it is, why the economy is the way it is, and how to actually raise, society, how to actually increase prosperity. They are just there as hired guns for the capitalists and for the landlords and the bankers and so forth. And you can see that with, the people advising Milei and so forth, and all these other kind of libertarian nutcases that exist today. The whole of bourgeois economics, as I say, taught in universities and textbooks. So there's no actual real scientific merit to it anymore. It's extremely idealistic. It's extremely mystical. It's all wrapped up in these mathematical models that don't represent and bear any resemblance to reality whatsoever. And then when it comes to trying to explain actual things that are going on in the world, actual economic phenomena, you find that the bourgeois economists completely stumped. I think when the 2008 crisis happened, famously, they had a whole gathering of all the most famous bourgeois economists, all the most kind of prestigious ones at the LSE, I think it was. And one of them declared there, saying, I think it was a Nobel Prize winner, saying everything we've taught about economics was at best wrong and at worst harmful. So when these actual events have happened, these massive titanic events, that's precisely when you want a scientist. You want, it's when you're really ill and you go to the doctor, that's when you want someone to tell you what's the actual disease and what's the actual cure. And yet these people are like going to the doctor and, they just prescribe you whatever their mate is trying to sell you from down the pub, that's what it amounts to. It's not a science anymore, economics under the modern day bourgeois.
It's interesting. I've got a quote here from a bourgeois economist called John Casanova. This was written 6 years before Marx was born, in 1812. So he says that labor is the sole source of wealth seems to be a doctrine as dangerous as it is false, as it unhappily affords a handle to those who would represent all property as belonging to the working classes, and the share which is received by others as a robbery or a fraud upon them. So what I find fascinating about this is that the bourgeois disavow their own. They look at the conclusions that Adam Smith and Ricardo draw about the source of value, and they go, absolutely not. No, can't have that, because if we tell the workers they're the ones who create the value, then what's the point of us?
And that's the whole point, is that at that point in history, when this guy Cazeneuve was writing in the early 19th century, you had started to see the creation of this mass working class, these grave diggers of capitalism, right? And they were starting to move. I mean, that date that you mentioned when this quote was said or written, that was around the time of the Peterloo massacre, for example, in Britain. And you've got subsequent to that, the rise of the trade unions. You've got the rise of Chartism in Britain. There was and all these kind of revolutionary movements. Obviously, you'd had the French Revolution, which was already a bit too far for some of the bourgeois of the time. Some of the ruling class a bit afraid of how far things were going, and therefore, you also had these thinkers who tried to represent the working class. These early socialists, English socialists, French socialists, particularly in England. Actually, you had these socialists who tried to use Ricardo and Smith's ideas against them. They actually were saying, okay, let's take the labour theory of value. Let's say the workers produce all the value. Why don't we receive the full fruits of our labour? These socialists asked, and they highlighted the same contradiction that had kind of confused Ricardo and used it against him, and used it to say, what we need is a system where workers do receive the full fruits of their labour, and that's what for them socialism represented. And so they were using these economic ideas of political economy, of the classical economists, against the bourgeois themselves, against the bosses, against the capitalists. And Marx built part of his ideas upon these guys as well, and said, exactly, like this is the logical conclusion of the labour theory of value. Actually, he was identifying there's this inherent exploitation of the working class going on that is leading to the profits of the capitalists. And not only that, but as I said earlier, it is also leading inherently to these crises of overproduction. And all of that was a very revolutionary conclusion of the labour theory of value that caused then these modern bourgeois economists, or the bourgeois economists who came after Ricardo, to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to just reject the labour theory of value altogether, say, no, we can't be having any of this. We need a different theory to explain the value of commodities. They came up with this idea of marginal utility, it was called. And Marx actually referred to these economists as the vulgar economists, because he said they weren't interested in scientifically understanding the system. They didn't understand the value of commodities. They didn't understand why capitalism went into crisis, and they were just these apologists. And and that idea of marginal utility, that then is what's taught basically in most bourgeois textbooks today. Yeah,
and it's really interesting because I have another quote from an economist called Eugene von Bombauer, who was a luminary of the Austrian school, which was influential on Millet, also influential on Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And he really explicitly and quite cynically says that the labour theory of value has gained acceptance as a result of the dissemination of socialist ideas. But he says, fortunately, it's losing ground amongst the economic circles of most countries in favour of marginal utility. So he openly says it's not that the labour theory of value is necessarily wrong. He doesn't argue from that point of view. He says it's associated with socialism. Fortunately, we're moving away from that in favour of marginal utility. It reminds me a little bit, actually, of an episode we did a couple of years ago with Fred, when he was talking about Lewis Henry Morgan's study of anthropology being disavowed by the bourgeois. And like Adam Smith, Lewis Henry Morgan was not a socialist. He was a liberal. He was a man of the Enlightenment. And, well, he was a Victorian, actually. But anyway, he was a liberal. He was an enlightened democratic liberal. And he developed a view of history which was very influential upon Engels when he was developing his theories about the origin of the state, the origin of private property, the origin of the family. And the anthropologists that followed on from Lewis Henry Morgan buried his ideas for decades because they've been influential on the development of historical materialism. So it seems that modern economists, they get their fingers burned by the logical conclusions of their best minds actually reinforcing and being adapted by and developed by the arguments of Marx.
That's right. And Marxism, by this point, when you have this rise of this Austrian school at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, by that point, Marxism was the official ideology of these mass workers' parties that were being created, social democracies, particularly in places like Germany and Austria, where you had these libertarian types. They were reacting against that, right? They could see the rise of this workers' movement with this socialist revolutionary ideology as it was then. And it was built ultimately on the labor theory of value. And they thought, well, if we can attack the labor theory of value, then we'll undermine Marxism. And that whole idea accelerated, particularly after the Russian Revolution. People like von Mises and Hayek, who are kind of also part of the disciples of this Austrian school, they were well known for explicitly being anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist, and for trying to develop a bourgeois theory of things like commodity production and exchange that would undermine the labor theory of value and undermine Marxism and revolutionary ideas at the time. That's what marginal utility was all about. That's why it's still taught today, because it's a very subjectivist view of value, right? Whereas Marx and the best side of the classical economists was to see something objective in value, i.e. the labor that goes into the production of things. Marginal utility was basically all about preferences. It's about the value that you personally ascribe to something, because it's valuable to you, it's useful to you. In other words, rather than seeing value as this exchange value, this thing governing the dynamics, the exchange of commodities, they were trying to see it as this personal subjective thing, like how much is it useful to me, which doesn't really explain anything, because something is useful to one person isn't necessarily useful to another. Whereas the value of something, the amount of labor time that's gone into it, is something objective that then has this lawfulness to it that Marx was explaining. And that shows you, if you like, the kind of dual character of people like Adam Smith, where on the one hand, they had these kind of more scientific ideas. They were trying to find something objective in things like the law of value and the exchange of commodities. And they touched upon these very materialist, scientific, objective ideas of the law of value, trying to understand capitalism scientifically. But on the other hand, they also had these very abstract models of the hunters and the fishermen and so forth, the men on a desert island. And it was that kind of very individualistic view that actually then paved the way for this idea of marginal utility and all the kind of modern bourgeois economics, all the vulgar economy. They took up, whereas Marx took up all the progressive, all the materialist, all the correct scientific ideas of the classical economists. Everyone who came afterwards on the bourgeois side, these vulgar economists, they took all the most reactionary, all the most retrograde, all the most idealistic and mystical and subjective ideas and ran with that, basically. And that's why you see this massive divergence today between bourgeois economics on the one side and Marxism on the other, even though they have this common lineage in the form of Adam Smith.
Just to bring this to a conclusion, Trotsky, I think, once said that official political economy is dead and real knowledge of capitalist society can be obtained only through Marx's Capital. Is that a true statement? Is it a full statement?
Well, I think, yeah, again, we've got to understand what was Marx trying to do with capital, right? It was, as he said at the beginning, a critique of political economy. It was him trying to wrestle with the ideas of his predecessors. But it was also an attempt to understand the capitalist system in order to ultimately to overthrow it, to understand that it couldn't be reformed, that we need a revolution, and to identify, the working class's vital role as well in production as the creator of all this wealth in society. And in that sense, it was this attempt to kind of come up with a scientific understanding of the world around us. And in that sense, it was trying to look at the most general laws, the most general dynamics that govern the motion of this system, and these laws that inherently have these contradictions that lead to these crises and so forth, that mean that capitalism is this inherently crisis-ridden system. There's this logic to capitalism that leads us to the situation we're in today. So I think, yeah, in that sense, we need capital, right? We need it. As Marx said, it was the most terrible missile ever launched at the heads of the bourgeoisie. That was his intention in writing Capitalism, was to hurl this missile into the camp of the bourgeoisie and deal them a blow from which they could never recover.
It's a pretty heavy book.
It is a very heavy book, especially if you read all 3 volumes of it. That's what he wrote to Engels, was his mission statement with in writing Capital. It was to arm the workers' movement with the general understanding of capitalism as a system, and the power they had to overthrow that, and the need to overthrow that. However, I would say that you cannot fully understand everything that's going on in the world today just by reading Capital, right? Marxism isn't some dogma, and Capital isn't some Bible that you can read and then just recant or just recite rather at people. It is a method, Marxism, ultimately, to try and make sense of the world, and we have to apply the general theory that Marx outlines in Capital to the concrete, real situation going on today, which includes obviously many economic processes, many economic forces and factors at play, but also political factors, right? Like Marx didn't just write Capital, he wrote many concrete articles looking at political struggles taking place, understanding things as part of a broader method of historical materialism, applying dialectical materialism. Actually, I think it was Lenin who said you can't fully understand Capital unless you read all of Hegel. In other words, unless you have a proper grasp of dialectical materialism. So I'd say to budding communists out there, by all means, get your teeth into Marxist economics. Probably start, before with some slightly more preliminary texts. Things like wage, labor, and capital, value, price, and profit. These kind of things. They're a good place to start for some of the introductory ideas of Marxist economics. We've also written a reader's guide to Capital, which tries to summarize the main ideas, the main themes. But also, get your teeth into the whole canon, if you like, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. Really get to grips with Marxism as a method, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and then go and try and apply it to the concrete situations we see today. Try and understand perspectives, try and understand all the chaos going on in the world using that method. And in that sense, the main takeaway is it's as I say, it's a way of trying to make sense of the world in order to change it.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Adam, thank you so much. That was a really interesting discussion.
Thanks very much for having me again.
And one thing that I just want to end on is this point that there's a tendency sometimes to mechanically separate Marx's economic theories from every other aspect of his work, from his philosophy, from historical materialism, but it's all part of a whole. It's Marx applying the dialectical materialist method to the world in which we live, where capitalism is the mode of production, where the working class is the revolutionary class. We have to understand the totality of his work to really understand the enormity of what he achieved with capital. And for that reason, I want to echo the recommendation that our viewers pick up the Capital reading guide, Understanding Marx's Capital. I'll put a link in the description to where you can get a copy. Also, the preliminary text that Adam mentioned if you want to dive into Marxist economics. So that's all we have time for with this episode. We'll be back in a month's time with a new installment of The Spectre of Communism. One last time, I've been Joe, and thank you so much for joining us.